first thing I noticed about the forest was how completely it held its breath. Morning mist still clung to the lower branches when I stepped beyond the weathered trail marker. The air smelled of damp soil, wet bark, and leaves that had been falling for centuries without ever quite reaching the earth. Every sound seemed wrapped in moss. My own footsteps landed softly, absorbed by layers of black earth so thick they felt almost cushioned. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt as though I had interrupted something that had been listening long before I arrived. The trees were impossibly old. Their trunks twisted together in slow spirals, bark split into deep furrows dark with moisture. Vines hung from nearly every branch, thick as wrists in some places, thin as cords in others. They swayed even when the air remained perfectly still. I blamed invisible drafts. By noon, I had begun noticing them more often. Whenever I paused to study my map or drink from my canteen, I caught movement at the edges of my vision. A vine would slowly uncurl from a branch. Another would drag lightly across bark before becoming perfectly motionless when I looked directly at it. I told myself it was perspective. My eyes were tired. Forests always created illusions. Still, I began checking behind me more frequently. The silence deepened the farther I walked. Birdsong disappeared first, then insects. Even the distant rustling that usually accompanies a living forest faded until only an occasional soft creak traveled through the canopy. It sounded less like branches rubbing together and more like old wood shifting under immense weight. Once I could have sworn I heard breathing. It came from somewhere beyond the trees, slow, patient inhalations that blended with the movement of leaves. When I stopped, they stopped. Hours later, I discovered roots crossing the trail. At first, they looked ordinary, but several appeared freshly disturbed. Damp soil clung to them in loose clumps, as though they had pushed upward only moments earlier. Tiny stones rested on top of exposed roots instead of beneath them. One root even stretched across footprints I distinctly remembered making minutes before. I stood there longer than I should have. Nothing moved. Yet the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that the roots weren't growing toward sunlight. They were growing toward me. I kept walking. The forest seemed reluctant to let me choose my own direction. Trails that appeared obvious narrowed unexpectedly. Fallen logs blocked familiar landmarks I could have sworn hadn't been there before. Every decision felt subtly encouraged. One gap between trees looked slightly brighter. Another seemed impossibly dark. Without thinking, I always chose the brighter path. Only later did I realize I never remembered making those choices. The vines returned. This time, one hung low enough to brush my shoulder. Its surface felt cold and faintly damp through my jacket. When I turned, it hung exactly where it should have, swaying gently. Yet I could not shake the certainty that it had reached farther than gravity allowed. I laughed once. The sound vanished almost immediately, swallowed by the trees before any echo could answer. That frightened me more than I admitted. Near evening, I found an enormous clearing where sunlight barely reached the ground. Ancient trunks surrounded it like pillars supporting an invisible ceiling. Moss coated everything in thick green layers. The air felt heavier there, carrying the earthy smell of rain despite clear skies overhead. In the center stood dozens of hanging vines. They formed loose curtains between the trees. None of them moved. I whispered, "Hello." Nothing answered. Then somewhere inside those curtains came a faint whisper. Not words. More like leaves rubbing together in rhythms almost resembling language. I backed away. One curtain of vines shifted. Only one. No breeze touched the others. I left quickly, pretending I hadn't seen it. Darkness arrived earlier beneath that canopy than it should have. The forest became shapes and shadows stitched together by pale mist. I pitched my small tent beside a fallen cedar and forced myself to eat. The food tasted strangely dull, as though the air itself had stolen flavor from everything. Sleep refused to come. Several times I heard soft scraping beyond the fabric. Not footsteps, something longer, dragging, sliding. Each sound circled my campsite before fading. Near midnight, I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. Nothing. only vines hanging from branches that I didn't remember standing so close. I shut the tent immediately. Morning brought no relief. The trail behind me had disappeared beneath tangled growth. Not overgrown, covered. Fresh vines stretched across the route in looping patterns that looked almost deliberate. For the first time, I considered turning back impossible. So I continued forward. The breathing returned. Louder now. It rose and fell beneath every ordinary sound until I could no longer tell whether it came from the forest or from inside my own chest. Even the trees seemed to lean differently. Their branches overlapped above me in narrowing arches that gently steered my path. Whenever I resisted, I found myself circling back. The realization arrived quietly. I wasn't navigating anymore. I was being guided. Hours later, I entered another clearing. Smaller, darker. The smell reached me first. Wet leaves, fresh bark. Cold earth opened after rain. Then I saw it. We saw a figure wrapped in vines. But the vines were tightening on their own. For a heartbeat, my mind refused to understand what my eyes had found. The figure stood upright among the trees without struggling. Thick vines circled the body from ankles to shoulders. Smaller tendrils covered the face completely, disappearing beneath layers of green and pale gray moss. I could not tell whether clothing remained beneath them. The silence became unbearable. Then came the sound. A slow tightening. Fibers stretching, wood creaking. The vines contracted almost lovingly, drawing themselves closer with tiny deliberate movements. I watched one loop sink deeper against the figure's arm. Another slowly twisted higher around the neck. The figure never resisted, never acknowledged me. I wanted to believe no one could survive standing so perfectly still. Yet something beneath those vines seemed to breathe. Once, very softly. Pity struck before fear. I took one hesitant step forward. Every vine in the clearing stopped moving simultaneously. The forest noticed me. The sensation arrived without warning. Countless unseen eyes, not watching from above or below, watching through bark, through moss, through leaves. The trees no longer surrounded the clearing. They enclosed it. The vines nearest my boots slowly lifted from the ground. Only a few centimeters. Enough. I stumbled backward. The tightening resumed around the figure, faster now. The sound multiplied until it surrounded me from every direction. Thousands of vines shifting together. Thousands. The whispering returned. Closer than ever. Not spoken into my ears. Spoken somewhere behind my thoughts. One phrase repeated itself without language, understood only through certainty. Stay. I ran. Branches caught my sleeves. Roots rose where I tried to step. Vines brushed my legs with feather-light touches that felt disturbingly intentional. None wrapped around me completely. They simply redirected me, correcting my path whenever I veered away from openings between the trees. Even my panic no longer felt entirely my own. Part of me wanted to stop, to listen, to stand quietly among those trunks until movement no longer seemed necessary. Rain began without clouds. Large cold drops fell through the canopy carrying the sharp scent of crushed leaves. The whispering faded behind me, replaced once more by impossible silence. Eventually I reached the trailhead, or something wearing its shape. My car remained where I had left it, damp with condensation. I drove without looking into the rearview mirror until the forest disappeared behind distant hills. Weeks passed, then months. People asked whether I enjoyed the hike. I always answered yes because explaining the truth sounded impossible. Sometimes I wake before dawn convinced I hear slow breathing beneath the walls of my house. Sometimes I find damp soil near my front door despite clear weather. Yesterday I noticed a thin green vine climbing the inside corner of my bedroom window. Cut it away. This morning it had returned. It wasn't growing toward the sunlight. It was growing toward my chair. And every time I look away, I become certain it has moved a little closer. The forest had been silent for hours before the wind began to speak. We had entered the valley just after dawn, when the mist still clung to the treetops and the air smelled of wet bark and cold stone. The trail was narrow, half hidden beneath fallen leaves that had been rotting for decades. Every step sank slightly into the earth, soft and reluctant to let go. I remember thinking how strange it was that the forest seemed to absorb sound. Even our breathing felt muffled, as if the trees were listening and didn't want us to disturb them. There were 4 of us, myself, Daniel, Mira, and Owen. We were supposed to be mapping the old logging routes for a research project. But the deeper we went, the less the forest resembled anything human. The trunks were enormous, twisted together like muscle fibers. The canopy blocked most of the light, leaving only thin shafts that pierced the gloom like spears. The air was heavy, damp, and faintly metallic, as though the forest had been bleeding for centuries. By noon, the wind began to move. It came from nowhere, threading through the branches with a low, steady hum. At first, it sounded like ordinary wind, soft, rhythmic, almost soothing. But then it changed. The tone deepened, carrying something beneath it: pattern, cadence, words. The wind carried a voice telling us we were being followed. Daniel froze mid-step. Mira turned slowly, scanning the trees. Owen laughed nervously, insisting it was just the wind echoing through the valley. But I had heard it clearly, each syllable distinct, carried on the air like breath against my ear. The voice was neither male nor female. It was old, cracked, and patient. We stood there for a long time listening. The forest didn't move. Then the wind stopped. We tried to convince ourselves it was imagination. The valley was known for strange acoustics. Sound bounced between the cliffs and distorted easily. But as we continued, the feeling of being watched grew heavier. The trees seemed to lean closer. The air thickened until it felt like walking through water. Mira began marking the trunks with chalk, small white circles to track our path. But every time we looked back, the marks were gone. The bark appeared smooth, untouched. Once, she swore she saw the chalk dust drifting upward instead of falling. By evening, the forest had swallowed the sun. We set up camp near a cluster of fallen logs. The ground was uneven, covered in roots that felt too deliberate, too symmetrical. Owen built a fire, but the flames burned strangely, thin and pale, as if the wood resisted combustion. The smoke rose straight up, forming a narrow column that vanished into the canopy without spreading. We ate in silence. Then the wind returned. It came from every direction at once, whispering through the leaves. The voice was softer this time, almost pleading. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them. They pressed against my thoughts like fingertips tracing the inside of my skull. Daniel threw dirt onto the fire, trying to silence the sound. Mira covered her ears. Owen muttered prayers he hadn't said since childhood. The voice faded, leaving behind a faint echo that lingered in the air long after the wind had died. That night, I dreamed of movement between the trees. Something tall and thin, gliding without sound. Its shape was wrong, too narrow, too fluid, like smoke given form. When I woke, the forest was still, but the air smelled faintly of rot, and the fire had burned out completely, leaving only cold ash. Daniel was gone. We found his pack near the edge of the clearing, torn open as if by claws. His footprints led into the darkness, but they stopped abruptly after 10 meters. The soil beyond was smooth, undisturbed, as though he had vanished mid-step. Mira wanted to leave immediately. Owen argued that we should search. I said nothing. The forest felt different now, alive in a way that defied reason. The trees seemed to pulse faintly, their bark shifting like skin under breath. Every sound echoed too long, returning distorted and unfamiliar. We followed Daniel's trail until we reached a narrow ravine. The air there was colder, sharper. Mist clung to the ground like smoke. At the bottom of the ravine stood a single tree unlike any other, its trunk pale and smooth, its branches bare despite the season. Something hung from one of those branches. It was Daniel's jacket, and beneath it, half buried in the soil, was a shape that looked human. We didn't dig. We didn't speak. We turned back. The wind followed us. It whispered through the leaves, repeating the same phrase over and over. though the words changed slightly each time. Sometimes it said we were being followed. Other times it said we were not alone. Once it said we were already found. Mira began crying quietly as we walked. Owen tried to comfort her, but his voice sounded hollow, as if the forest had stolen its warmth. I kept my eyes on the path, though I wasn't sure there was one anymore. The ground shifted beneath us, roots rising and falling like breathing. At dusk, we reached a clearing filled with standing stones. They were arranged in a circle, each carved with symbols that looked like eyes. The air inside the circle was perfectly still. No wind, no sound. The moment we stepped inside, the forest seemed to retreat, as if unwilling to cross the boundary. We rested there, though none of us slept. Sometime after midnight, the wind returned. It didn't enter the circle. It circled it, brushing the stones with faint whispers. The voice was clearer now, almost conversational. Spoke in fragments, warnings, pleas, commands. I felt each word vibrate through my bones. Then something moved beyond the stones. A tall, thin shape glided between the trees, its form bending unnaturally as it approached. It didn't walk. It drifted. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The air around it shimmered, bending light like heat over asphalt. The voice in the wind grew frantic. Followed, found, chosen. The entity stopped at the edge of the clearing. It didn't enter. It simply watched. Its face was a blur, shifting like smoke. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, pale and distant. The wind wrapped around it, carrying whispers that no longer sounded like warnings. They sounded like invitations. Owen stepped forward. Mira screamed. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back into the circle. The entity tilted its head further, as if curious. The wind surged, carrying a single clear phrase. Come back. The forest groaned. Branches bent inward. Roots rose from the soil. The stones vibrated beneath our feet. We ran. The forest closed around us, guiding us with unseen hands. Paths shifted. Trees leaned. The wind pushed at our backs, urging us forward. The entity followed, gliding silently between the trunks. Every time I looked back, it was closer. We didn't stop until we reached the valley's edge. The wind died instantly. The forest fell silent. The entity stood at the tree line, watching. Then it stepped backward and vanished into the darkness. We never returned. But the forest didn't let us go. In the weeks that followed, Mira woke screaming from dreams she couldn't remember. Owen stopped speaking entirely, staring at windows as if expecting someone to appear on the other side. I tried to convince myself we were safe, that the valley was miles away, that whatever lived there couldn't cross into our world. But the wind disagreed. It found us. It carried faint whispers through cracks in the walls, through vents, through the spaces beneath doors. Sometimes it said nothing intelligible, just soft murmurs that made my skin crawl. Other times it repeated the same phrase from the valley, as if reminding us of a promise we had broken. We were being followed. One night, I woke to the sound of leaves rustling inside my house. Not outside, inside. I followed the sound to the hallway, where a thin trail of damp soil led toward the living room. The air smelled of moss and cold stone. When I turned on the light, the soil stopped abruptly in the center of the room, as if whoever or whatever left it had vanished mid-step. The next morning, Mira called me. Her voice shook. She said she saw something tall and thin standing at the edge of her yard, its form bending unnaturally in the wind. She blinked, and it was gone. But the wind carried a single whisper into her ear. Come back. I didn't know what to tell her. That night, I heard tapping on my bedroom window. Slow, deliberate. I didn't look, couldn't. The tapping stopped only when the wind rose, carrying a familiar voice through the darkness. Soft, patient, and impossibly close. A voice telling me I am still being followed.